If everything in vintage watches you could learn in 4 years, you would spend at least a full semester just on the first 15 years of Speedmaster. It is so dense. I mean, you could get a doctorate in it. It's ridiculous. Hi, this is James Lamdin from Analog Shift, and on this special edition of Work From Home Fine Points, we're going to look at vintage watches and who's wearing them. John Mayer's passion for Rolex is legendary. Here he's wearing a Rolex Explorer 2. The Explorer line has become an absolute staple of the Rolex collection today that has its DNA in extreme alpine sports. The original Explorer line was basically designed after the attempts of Everest by Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. This particular one has what we call a polar white dial and likely dates to the early to mid 1990s. This is a transitional model for Rolex that explored the use of different materials as Rolex moved from what we consider traditional manufacturing techniques into the modern era. It is what many of us would refer to as neo-vintage. Neo-vintage is a new term for collectors. It identifies an era of manufacture that sort of blends traditional manufacturing techniques and materials with the future. For the most part, Rolexes from the 80s and 90s would fall into this category. They use materials like sapphire crystals instead of acrylic. They use tritium luminescent material instead of more modern luminova. This is a transition from the past to the present. What's interesting for collectors today is that there's a lot of really great bargains in this era. They're not properly vintage, but they're not the new stuff either. One of the reasons people are so interested in neo-vintage is that they still have the ability to garner patina. Newer watches have such high quality materials that they won't break down over time, at least not in our lifetimes. So all they do is end up looking old and used, whereas vintage watches have this tendency to develop really interesting, unique characteristics over time. That is why many collectors prefer vintage. They really, truly become unique. It's very clear that John Mayer's love of Rolex goes back even further. Here we're looking at him wearing the original Rolex Explorer 2. This is a Rolex reference 1655. The Explorer 2 was actually originally designed for spelunking, a sport in which you go underground for perhaps days at a time. As a result, they needed the wearers of these watches the ability to tell what time it was without any reference from the sun. So it has a 24-hour movement just like a GMT. Unlike a GMT Master, it does not have a rotating bezel. It has a fixed steel bezel with 24 hours on it, so you'll always know whether it's AM or PM while you're looking at the watch. These early Explorer 2s are often referred to as orange hand Explorers. This was a design that left the Rolex catalog until the 2000s when it was reintroduced. And today you can go into a Rolex dealer and find the new version of this watch. Here, John is wearing one of the kings of the Rolex collection, the Rolex Daytona. What's notable about this particular example is that it is an Oyster Cosmograph Daytona. This is a very long name for what everyone just calls a Daytona. In short, it's only an Oyster if it has waterproof case. And in order to make a chronograph waterproof, you need to have screw-down pushers. So if you look carefully at those stopwatch buttons where you start, stop, and reset the movement, you'll notice that they have a little flange that can be screwed down to be waterproof underwater. It also has an acrylic crystal, and it has that classic Panda dial with the silver dial with black subsidiary registers. If you had the reverse with a black back and lighter colored subsidiary registers, they are affectionately referred to as reverse Pandas. Maroon 5's Adam Levine clearly has a great taste in vintage Rolexes. This is the Paul Newman Daytona. Paul Newman's Daytona was recently sold for an eye-watering $17.8 million at auction here in New York just a couple years ago. But what's interesting about the Paul Newman Daytona model was that the stylized decoration on the dial was originally completely uninteresting to consumers. These watches languished on store shelves for up to a decade and eventually sold for their original retail of just a few $100s. As the legend goes, Paul Newman was gifted one of these and he just wore it with somewhat abandon and actually gave his watch to his daughter's ex-boyfriend as a gift when he found out he didn't have a watch to tell the time. It wasn't until many years later that an Italian magazine reportedly published a photograph of Paul Newman wearing the watch, and it was picked up by an early breed of European vintage watch enthusiasts. It was nicknamed the Paul Newman Daytona. Anything that's got a nickname is pretty much a sure thing in the collector community. This particular reference has pumper pushers that don't screw down, so it's not considered a waterproof oyster model, but it does have that wonderful panda dial configuration. Here, Adam is wearing the original Rolex Submariner. This is a reference 6538, also known as a Big Crown Submariner. This is the same model that was popularized by Sean Connery in the James Bond film Thunderball. What makes these watches so desirable and different than their current Submariner counterparts is that they don't have crown guards. They don't have those little protective elements on the side of the case to keep you from knocking into the crown. Furthermore, the crowns were, you guessed it, big. They were oversized. They were designed to be easily grippable by gloved, wetsuited hands for use underwater. These are very much the prototypical Submariners, and they are one of the most desirable, sought after, and valuable vintage watches on the planet. Ellen DeGeneres. Ellen's real passion in Rolex is clearly the Daytona. She's got a great collection of both vintage and modern Daytonas, but here we're looking at the ultimate grail Rolex Daytona. This is a Paul Newman reference 6241, produced in solid gold. This one also carries the nickname John Player Special, as it references and evokes the color scheme of the racing livery of the classic cigarette brand. So the 6241 that she's got here features those pumper pushers, it features the black acrylic bezel, an oyster bracelet, and carries a price tag pretty close to $1 million today. Daniel Day Kim. Here, Daniel is wearing my favorite vintage Rolex. This is the reference 1675 GMT Master. The GMT Master was originally asked for by Pan American airline executives. They asked Rolex to create a watch that could read 2 different time zones for departure and destination as intercontinental air travel was beginning, and they needed a watch that could tell their pilots time at destination and departure simultaneously. The 1675 has developed an absolutely cult-like following and is popular in matte and gilt dial variants, steel, gold, two-tone variants, and a variety of different bezel and bracelet configurations. Daniel's watch is fitted with what we call a blueberry bezel because it is all blue. These are fairly controversial bezels. In fact, some collectors believe that they are completely fake. Rolex has never confirmed or denied, for the most part, whether or not these things were actually made, whether or not they were actually sold at retail, whether it could have been some special order or some test bed that never got produced. But there are a number of these things out on the market. They're very collectible, they're very valuable, and they're very cool. So whether or not they're totally legit or just partially legit, or maybe not legit at all, it's a great look. And Daniel Day Kim, don't listen to anyone. Whether or not it's real, fake, or somewhere in between, it's a great looking watch. I love it. Here is the always stylish Bradley Cooper rocking a Rolex GMT Master two-tone, affectionately known as a root beer. One of the things that I love so much about Rolex GMTs is that they can be done in any different number of configurations and materials without losing their level of cool. You can have a steel one, you can have a gold one, you can have a golden steel one, you can have a black one, a red one, a Pepsi one, a blueberry one, a black dial. You can put it on an oyster bracelet, a Jubilee bracelet, you can put it on leather. They're all cool. Bradley's here has that brown dial and a bicolor brown gold bezel, which is the really quintessential root beer look that was popularized by Clint Eastwood in the 1970s. We've talked before about Ryan Gosling and his Rolex Air King, his beautiful, simple, really base model Rolex that's been with him for a very long time. Ryan's love of the simpler Rolex models has even followed him on set. Here we see a picture of him working on Crazy Stupid Love, wearing a Rolex Oyster bubble back produced in yellow gold. What's really interesting about this watch is it has a California dial. A California dial is a name that no one really knows where it came from, but it refers to a dial that has half Roman and half Arabic numerals scattered around the dial. It's just something that was believed to be popular in the 1930s. It was used by Rolex, it was used by Panerai, and today it's more of a curiosity than anything else, but they are really cool and they're a throwback to a great era in Rolex design. This particular model is referred to as a bubble back because the back of the case of the watch was bubbled out. This was an early form of automatic watch that used a very large rotor that took up frankly, quite a bit of room. So looking back, particularly from a perspective where things have gotten smaller and thinner and a little bit more precise, this is a sort of bulbous design, but they are desirable and actually incredibly comfortable. Sylvester Stallone. Sly has a great appreciation for watches. He's been tied with Panerai and Richard Mille and a number of other projects in the last few years, showing that his love of large, sporty watches is really all-consuming. However, it wasn't always so. One of Sly's favorite possessions is his early Rolex 1680/8, the earlier version of this watch, an 18-karat gold Submariner that he bought after his success in Rocky. The 1680 was the first Rolex Submariner to feature a date function. Previous iterations of the Submariner simply told the time in hours, minutes, and seconds. There's an old adage that if you need to know what day it is while you're diving underwater, you're properly f***ed. But it's useful in virtually every other use in human life. His watch actually has a Tiffany signature on the dial, indicating that it was purchased from a Tiffany store. It was an authorized partnership in the 1970s, and I think it makes that watch, which is already cool as hell, even cooler. We've talked a lot about how subtle differences can mean huge value discrepancies with vintage watches. Unlike modern watches, vintage watches were produced with materials that create patina, and no two watches will age the same. Another differentiating factor can be a double signature on a dial. So you have the brand manufacturing signature, Rolex, Omega, Tissot, Longines, Audemars Piguet, you fill in the blank. But many of these brands sold through partner stores. That could be Tiffany or Cartier, Meister, Gobelin, any number. Those secondary signatures printed on the dial, if they're genuine, can mean huge value increases to collectors. However, buyer beware. It's relatively easy to add a secondary signature to a dial at a much later date, increasing the value and pulling the wool over your eyes. So if you are interested in buying one of these slightly more special examples, I would highly encourage that you buy from someone you know and can trust. McDreamy. Patrick Dempsey, seen here wearing a vintage Heuer Monaco. Heuer, as it was so known before it was acquired by TAG, or Technique Avant-Garde, produced some of the most exceptional and beautiful racing-style chronographs of the mid-century, the golden era of sports car racing. The Monaco, with its square shape, was introduced in 1969 and coincided with the launch of Heuer's first automatic chronograph movement, the Caliber 11. This particular example is fitted with a gray dial with black subsidiary registers. It's a deep cut, and I love this watch because they're more commonly seen with the blue dial with the white subsidiary registers, of course popularized by the King of Cool himself, Steve McQueen. In this shot from The Wolf of Wall Street, Leonardo DiCaprio is wearing a TAG Heuer Series 1000 diving watch. This is kind of an interesting watch that's very evocative of the era. From a design standpoint, it is reminiscent of a Rolex Submariner, and it also features a bracelet design that is very similar to the Rolex Jubilee style bracelet that you might find on a Datejust or a GMT Master. But make no mistake, this is not a super high quality watch. It has that quartz movement inside with the oscillating crystal instead of the gears and springs of a proper mechanical watch, and it's gold plated. It's not solid gold. It's probably why he takes it off and throws it away partway through the movie. Daniel Craig, James Bond himself. Interestingly, despite the fact that he wears Omega on screen, he's also wearing Omega off screen. This is a vintage Seamaster. It's produced in steel, has subsidiary seconds, which is a small register just below the main hands that run the seconds continually. It's beautiful. This is classic. Looks to be late 50s, perhaps early 60s. It is his personal watch, and there he is wearing it on a red carpet event, proving that Omega has not lost its sense of style ever, just like James Bond. Prince William. Here, Prince William is wearing an Omega Seamaster 300 Professional. This is a model that was popularized by Pierce Brosnan's portrayal of James Bond in GoldenEye in 1996. It sort of signaled a change in Omega's design language, and one that they're still using today. I assume that Prince Williams does not do any of the pretty cool things that Pierce Brosnan's did. It's got no lasers or bomb detonators, I imagine, but it's still a great look, and it's a great classic design. Matt Scannell. Singer, songwriter, and frontman of the great band Vertical Horizon, Matt has a wonderful collection of vintage watches. His love is definitely focused on the Omega Speedmaster. The Omega Speedmaster was chosen by NASA to accompany man on our greatest accomplishment, landing on the moon. This particular watch, which dates to the 1970s, has a tremendously beautiful patina. The tritium indices and hands have faded to this creamy color, and most interestingly, it has a double signature on the dial from the retailer Meister. The study of Omega Speedmasters is a dense one. It is one of the most important and popular vintage watches of all time. It is iconic in that it has barely changed since its introduction in 1957. In fact, yes, you can go out to an Omega authorized dealer right now and buy a watch that looks a whole lot like the ones that they were producing in the 50s and 60s. The history is really, really vibrant. It's interesting because the Speedmaster wasn't actually originally designed to go to space. It was actually designed for racing applications, hence the name Speedmaster. The development of this watch has been lockstep with advancements in timekeeping, and they're actually going back to some of their roots, introducing new versions of some of their earlier movements, which, in an interesting twist of fate, are preferred by many collectors. In an earlier video, we looked at Kanye West's Cartier Crash. Here we're looking at Angelina Jolie wearing an absolutely beautiful vintage Tank Louis Cartier. This is the watch that allegedly proved the inspiration for the crash when it came back deformed from the heat of a car accident. The Cartier Tank Louis drew its original design inspiration from World War I French battle tanks. And as you can see in the profile, it features two elongated edges with a very simple and luxurious dial, printed Roman indices, and blued steel hands. These would have featured an early manual winding movement and were just as beautiful then as they are now, and vice versa. Absolutely timeless design. Karl Lagerfeld. Here we see the late fashion tycoon wearing an Audemars Piguet Royal Oak. This model is referred to as the Jumbo. It was introduced in 1972 and was designed by Gerald Genta for Audemars Piguet. This watch was an absolute Hail Mary during an absolute worst time in the Swiss watchmaking industry, a time we refer to as the quartz crisis. This watch cost way more than a gold Rolex, despite the fact that it was produced in steel. It was a runaway success and is credited with saving the luxury sport watch category of the industry. In fact, it may have even created that entire category all its own. Karl Lagerfeld is wearing this watch, and it's got a couple interesting things going on here. One is that it's black. It might have been the first example of a customized black watch in history. And secondly, he's wearing it over the cuff. There's not too many guys I know who could pull that off, but when you're Karl Lagerfeld, you want to paint your watch black and wear it over your cuff, who's going to stop you? Collecting vintage watches is one of the most rewarding components of wristwatch collecting. Unlike modern watches, these things each have their own story and design. They have their own heritage. They have their own patina. They're all unique. They're all beautiful snowflakes. But it's also a bit of a minefield. You want to make sure that you follow a few simple steps to make sure that you're not getting taken. First and foremost, buy the seller. Make sure you're buying a watch from somebody you know and can trust. Secondly, condition, condition, and condition. Don't let anyone tell you that you should be only looking at mint condition watches. In fact, patina and wear are part of the story and part of the charm of these great old things. But you do want to make sure that you are buying what you want and you're not being talked into or settling for something less than you want. Lastly, probably pay a little bit more than you think you should, because if it's a great watch and it's market value, there's probably something wrong with it. Somebody would own it already. So maybe pay tomorrow's price or next month's price. But if you follow those earlier steps, buying the seller and buying a great watch from the start, you'll never have anything to regret.